Good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Cody Norrid, Executive Director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we sit down with practitioners, academics, and faith leaders to talk at the intersections of climate change, faith, and environmental justice. And this morning, we are lucky enough to have Tejas Kotek. Tejas is the transit chair for the Georgia chapter of the Sierra Club, and he also serves on the Sierra Club board. He works there to expand and improve transit across the state of Georgia. His day job is also as a transportation planner at the Atlanta Regional Commission, where he works on project evaluation, safety planning, and resiliency issues. Tejas, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
So to start, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into the role of working on transit?
Sure. So I grew up in Gwinnett County, Snellville, Georgia, and back then I had this vision of myself as, a budding environmentalist, but to me back then it meant I'll get a hybrid or an EV car if those ever came out. And well, now they are, and I'm happy to see it. But I grew up in suburbia, so cars were my focus. I went to Georgia Tech for college, and living in the city and then moving here more permanently, it got me to think about other ways to get around. And transit became a way that I got around to groceries, to internships, to seeing friends in other parts of the metro during and, of course, after college. And that really got me thinking, what is the most sustainable way to get around? What is an easy way to get around? And transit, while not easy in terms of the time you have to spend on it right now, for me, it was a lot more stress-free. And because I started learning a lot more about climate change and emissions and the impact of land use on our society and on the planet, I saw transit as a very good way to live my values in terms of I want to live a sustainable and environmentally friendly life. So now I live a life where the only ways I get around are I use transit, I use sidewalks, or I use ditches in the side of the road if the sidewalk doesn't exist. So I got into transit because it became my lived experience and I wanted to find ways to make it better. So that's how I got into the advocacy world and started doing more work with and through the Sierra Club.
Well, I'm excited to dive into that this morning and hear more about your journey and the work that you're doing. I think that you've got a reading for us this morning, and I think the reading's pretty poignant. So I'll invite you to offer some of that, if you will.
Thank you. So I am a child of the late 20th century. So my reading is from Dr. Seuss's The Lorax, a very classic and hopefully well-known tale. So I'll start at the end and get to the point of a line that really hit home to me. No more trees, no more needs, no more work to be done. So in no time, my uncles and aunts, everyone all waved me goodbye. They jumped into my cars and drove away under the smog's smuttered stars. Now all that was left beneath the bad-smelling sky was my big empty factory, the Lorax, and I. The Lorax said nothing, just gave me a glance. Just gave me a very sad, sad backward glance as he lifted himself by the seat of his pants. And I'll never forget the grim look on his face when he hoisted himself and took leave of this place through a hole in the smog without leaving a trace. And all that the Lorax left here in this mess was a small pile of rocks with one word, unless. Whatever that meant. Well, I just couldn't guess. But that was long, long ago. But each day since that day, I've sat here and worried away. Through the years, while my buildings have fallen, I've worried about it with all my heart. But now, says the Onceler, now that you're here, the word of the Lorax seems perfectly clear. Unless, someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Uh, Growing up with this story and stories and messages from things like Captain Planet really helped me get into thinking about things through an environmental and sustainability lens. So not just discrete things that I should do or not do to be more eco-friendly, but how can I shape my life around this? And trying to balance the need for how can I work to change social and society level issues and problems, because we need to do that while also acknowledging there can be personal things I do at a personal and individual level that can have a big impact. And especially if I have these values, if I live these values and I try and promote them to other people, while it's starting small with just me, if I can expand it to some family, some friends, and eventually more of society, then yeah, it can have a really big impact on sustainability, equity, climate change. So this book got me thinking about what I can do, what are some individual things I can do. And as I grew up, I realized start small, start with me, then keep going.
That's great. I mean, such a classic tale. So thank you for bringing that back into front of vision today. So let's start simple. Let's talk about what is transit. What do you classify under that bucket? It's probably different than what people think about when they think about transit or they hear that. And then what's the importance of transit generally for people and for climate?
Sure. I give a relatively broad idea and definition of transit. It is any form of publicly accessible mass transportation. Mass transportation simply means it moves a lot of people from a point A to point B, and in many cases, any point in between. Publicly accessible means anyone has access to it. Anyone is able to get on either freely or by paying some standard fee. In most of the major cases in Metro Atlanta and throughout the state of Georgia, that means they are publicly funded at some level and publicly run at some level, but there can also be privately run public transit. So it's at that level, it's more about can just anyone off the street access it and get on this van or train or bus, and not necessarily where the funding comes from.
Okay.
Transit to me is very important from a climate standpoint, because the transportation sector is where most of US emissions come from. About 29 to 31% of US carbon emissions come from the transportation sector every year. And it's going to go up and down over the next decade as we begin to electrify our transportation sector. And that is a very good thing. But an additional thing that we have to think about is land use. Where are we going to put all of these cars? If we shift from all gas cars to all electric cars overnight, we're still going to have a lot of climate problems because we have massive roads and massive parking lots taking up our spaces. In many parts of not just suburbia, but also within our central cities, you can go to a store and their parking lot takes up 2 or 3 times as much space as the store itself. That's not an efficient use of land, especially in our downtowns and city centers where land is increasingly valuable and expensive. What if somebody were able to take a bus or a train to those locations and had nice tree-shaded sidewalks to walk on?
Yeah.
These are other things that we need to think about when we are trying to build a sustainable transportation system. It's not just what fuel do we use to power these vehicles, it's what are the vehicles themselves and what are the land use options and development patterns of all the places we are going to.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. How do we in Georgia or even in the United States, how do we stack up in terms of, publicly available transit and clean transit?
Mhm. It really varies state by state and certainly metro area by metro area. One issue that we have here in the state of Georgia is, so MARTA is the 8th or 9th largest public transportation system within the United States, and that's by a mix of its budget and the number of riders it serves per day. But one big problem it faces is that it gets zero help from the state. Every other major transit system within the United States gets local funding, federal funding, and funding from its state government. MARTA gets local and federal funding. It does not get any help from the state. In fact, until pretty recently, the state had a lot of very hard constraints on how MARTA could raise and spend money. The
Yeah.
state is slightly more supportive now, but not to the point where it is giving reliable annual money to our transit system.
What do you think the disconnect is there? Like, what's the barrier or misunderstanding to why the state doesn't support funding something like a MARTA?
Yeah, there are two major answers to that. So most of the modern day answer, most of the answer in 2021 is it is a mix of classism, that people think that only poor people ride transit. So it's classism, and we certainly see that even in our more democratic counties, that there's a classism there of who will ride transit. There's a lot of people are taught, okay, the normal way to do things is to have a car and your single family house. The idea of riding the bus and living in a multi-family apartment, while those could be more sustainable in a lot of measures, those are considered either you don't do them or they are a phase in your life, but they're not the normal. So it's that sense of classism in how we represent these things. Historically, racism. We have a very white-led and rural-red state government, and they saw MARTA and most of our public transportation as something that serves the majority Black area around Atlanta. And on one hand, there's certainly some truth to that from just who rides MARTA and who has historically ridden MARTA, but it's also such a large portion of our state that you would think that anyone should care about it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was in very recent years, like not even a decade ago, we had state legislators refer to MARTA as moving Africans rapidly through Atlanta. This was something that they said boldly and gleefully to reporters of what, just a reason not to support it.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of reasons that have transcended into expectations of what it is to be an American, expectations of class and income that are a little bit more prevalent now. For decades, it was racism.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to talk about an issue that's kind of related to that, which is equity when it comes to transit. And, a lot of people and a lot of time is spent thinking about, if you get on public transportation here in Georgia, how much longer does it take you to get somewhere than it does to get in a car or something, because of things like a lack of investment or not enough regular times for stops and for people to get on. And so I wonder if you could speak to that and kind of What are the barriers to that? And then what are some possible solutions to that to get a reliable transit network?
Mhm. Yes, definitely there's an equity issue in both who transit serves and how well transit can serve them. And that's going to vary depending on specific corridors and specific, say, cities or counties where transit either currently exists or where it could exist. There are issues of, do we want a transit system that is, say, fast and reliable, but maybe it doesn't go everywhere? Or do we want a transit system that it goes everywhere? Like, do we want a bus that will wind through a traditional single family neighborhood because there are some people it can pick up there? Or do we want to focus on buses and rail that goes up and down major corridors because that's where we can have the most ridership? And ridership is typically based on uh, some form of density, and that density includes both people live along this corridor and there are jobs and destinations along this corridor. So both of these need to work in tandem. And on one side, the idea of running transit that picks up a lot of riders is very important from a climate perspective. The more riders that transit has, the more chance that at least some of those riders are switching out a car trip for a bus or a train trip. And that's really important from a climate standpoint and from a getting money into the system standpoint. Uh, to an extent, transit also needs to be a social service. So it does need to go to a lot of places. So maybe we do need a bus to wind through a single family neighborhood, even though that is inefficient from, say, a time perspective, because of the people who it's picking up. Maybe this is an older neighborhood with lots of seniors in it who rely on transit to get to medical trips or to groceries or just to see their family. So we have to balance these two needs for both like equity and climate reasons and overall efficiency of the system. These things, sometimes they can work in tandem, other times they work against each other. And we need to figure out, while we have all of these constraints in budget and resources with our transit systems, what do we want to value more right now? Certain things that can be done to make transit more efficient in the short term is cities and counties need to really start considering basic investments and innovations in things like sidewalks and trails, making sure that when people hop on and off their bus, they have a place they can walk as opposed to walking in the middle of the dirt or the grass. Relatedly, safe crosswalks that are spaced at a reasonable distance in between both bus stops and destinations. So rather than having to walk half a mile in between bus stops or half a mile in between your bus stop and the next crosswalk, have things spaced every few hundred feet or maybe every quarter mile, because that will allow people an option of they get off the bus and they're able to cross the street to their job or their grocery store or their friend's house. There's also a thing called dedicated bus lanes or bus only lanes. These are where we either, in some cases, it's necessary to build a brand new lane that is only for buses. In many places within, especially Metro Atlanta, we have extra lanes. We have built corridors through our like dense urban areas that are 4 lanes on either side or 3 lanes on either side. We don't really need that. We can take one of those lanes and say, what we want here is we want to value transit and we want to value moving people over moving cars.
Yeah, we definitely don't need all those lanes if we're putting a lot of those people on buses that are reliable and getting to where they need to go.
And there's also this idea of, yeah, people over cars. Like, do you want to move one bus with 40 people on it, or do you want to move 40 cars?
Yeah.
Traditional thought patterns and traditional engineering standards have valued cars over people. Uh, our standards don't really care
Yeah.
how many people are in your car, they care about the car itself.
Yeah. Well, let me ask a question about that. So, shifting our lens a little bit to Georgia and Drawdown, Georgia specifically, through that study, transportation is a huge part of what's going to transform our sector so that we can meet some climate goals by 2030, both in the electrification of the grid, electrification of the fleet, but also something that we've been paying attention to is kind of the infrastructure that can allow for expansion of things like MARTA or even EVs. And so, what do you see are the barriers in Georgia to expanding transit and expanding electrified infrastructure?
Mhm. A lot of it right now does come from the top at the state level. So the way the state has set up our transit system in terms of how it is able to expand, they've in recent years allowed a bit more flexibility to it, but everything is very much based county by county. So if Cobb or Gwinnett ever decide to buy into MARTA, there need to be multiple steps at the local level. The Board of Commissioners in those counties need to develop their own transit plan. They need to get that approved through the ATL board, which is a regional committee that helps to give us a better regional sense and regional cohesion for our transit in Metro Atlanta. But they have to get it approved by that board, and then they need to put a referendum to everyone in their county. And that is the case for Cobb, for Gwinnett, for all of the other counties in the metro area that are studying transit. And
Yeah.
right now we have a lot of our more suburban and exurban counties that are studying that. So Henry, Douglas, Rockdale, Spalding, Fayette County, all of these counties are undergoing either a comprehensive transportation plan or a transit master plan. And those are great. Those could develop into great plans, but then they need to put it in front of their voters, and their voters have to approve an additional sales tax on themselves to pay for all of this. And because so much of that effort, so much of the money has to come from the local level with no state assistance, it makes it very difficult to expand transit in Georgia.
Yeah.
So if the state were more willing to provide money to transit efforts, especially in terms of funding, not just building, say, more rails or buying buses, but also paying for the day-to-day operations of transit so that we could run more buses, run more trains.
Yeah.
That would help a lot.
Yeah.
From the power sector, a lot of it comes down to what our Public Service Commission wants to decide. If they really want an aggressive tactic, an aggressive timeline for electrifying the state of Georgia. And it also depends how much they want to be an oversight board or a passive partner with Southern Company and Georgia Power.
Say that again, Tejas, just so nobody misses that.
That's
a good point.
How much they want to be a more aggressive oversight board to Southern Company and Georgia Power, or more simply a passive partnership.
Yeah, that's very good. That's a very good point. So shifting a little bit from the state down to the city level, cities, especially in Georgia, have been a place where we've been able to experiment with 100% clean energy plans, commitments to meet those goals by 2030, 2040, experimentations on retrofit programs or transportation programs. And so what part do cities play in advancing this agenda and kind of demonstrating that there's an opportunity to advance these infrastructure solutions and demonstrate that they're successful?
local governments, especially at the city and county level, are key uh, for two reasons. One is everything we've talked about of that's where the action happens. That is where we get a lot of the local plans, a lot of the local money. The state right now doesn't really want to be involved. Hopefully that will change over the next decade. But right now, it's cities and counties that have to lead the fight in Georgia.
Mm.
And also, cities and counties, when cities and counties make a change, citizens and residents notice almost immediately. The city and county level is where we get our day-to-day changes and day-to-day obstacles and improvements that we can see at a very ground level. And these are the places where if something is changing in, say, our sales taxes, we notice immediately. Things in our state level and federal level taxes, we will eventually see them, but we may not see them until tax day. Local taxes, we see those immediately the next time we go out for groceries.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Things that cities and counties can do to really affect transportation, like transportation quality, equity, and climate, a lot of them are really basic things. It's one is what we can call a fix it first mentality. So put aside building new roads and bridges and start with maintaining what you already have first. So that simple idea of maintenance has to come first. Maintenance can be cheaper overall. It can still build a lot of local jobs. And it gives you an opportunity to do some retrofits. So you are repaving a road, maybe you can repave it with porous materials. And porous materials have like just these tiny holes in them that can absorb rainwater and stormwater, and that can help with flooding. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can take a wide road and say, okay, we don't need this many lanes. Let's turn one of them into a transit only lane, or maybe let's get rid of it entirely and have a wider sidewalk and some trees. So it gives you opportunity for retrofits, and that can be retrofits in how things look aesthetically. It can be the materials you use or which modes of transportation you value.
Sure.
And it's also making sure that when we are building new things, we are building things that support more sustainable forms of transportation. And that can be building transit-friendly infrastructure, which transit-friendly infrastructure is typically basic things like sidewalks, trails. Those are the two major things, like sidewalks and trails. If you're riding the bus, at some point you are a pedestrian.
Yeah.
So build infrastructure that is friendly and sustainable for people who need to walk, which is most everyone.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, you talked about roads and bridges briefly, and so that gives us a good bridge to talk about federal infrastructure and some things that have, the federal infrastructure package has been a big topic of conversation. The American Jobs Plan has been a big topic of conversation, and the idea of expanded infrastructure. So not just roads and bridges, but how do we electrify parts of our sector? How do we increase clean energy transportation, EVs, electrifying buses, sidewalks, all those sorts of things. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the federal infrastructure package, American Jobs Plan, what's kind of in there that relates to transit and how that would impact things in Georgia.
Mm-hmm. So the original American Jobs Plan had a lot of really good ideas and a lot of really good just buckets of money that would have helped cities, counties, and states better invest in basic transportation needs like sidewalks, maintenance, and begin the move towards electrification. It would have also shoveled a lot of money towards public transportation, so things like MARTA or New York transit system, as well as passenger rail, so things like Amtrak. and to like significantly improve the quality and tenure outlook of those transportation systems. It has been debated and watered down over the months to try and get to something that can at least appear bipartisan if it passes. And it's still a relatively good bill, but it's not as good as it was when the Biden administration first proposed it.
Sure.
Uh, but the American Jobs Plan would have basically been a one-time injection of a lot of money. There is also something that Congress has to do every few years called just the Transportation Funding Authorization Bill. This is a bill that helps fund transit agencies and state DOTs for a 5 to 6 year period. The current one we are using is called the FAST Act, F-A-S-T, and it really promotes what we in the transportation industry consider the status quo. It gives a lot of money to states with very few strings attached and is focused a lot on building new highways, building more lanes. The House of Representatives has put out a very good, very progressive, very climate and equity focused bill right now called the Invest Act. And if that passes, that would do so much more than the American Jobs Plan would. That plan, it still gives money to states and gives states some discretion, but it makes sure that they focus on doing their maintenance first, on valuing people who take transit, pedestrians, cyclists, and ADA compliance in a very strong way. It puts a lot more climate focus on all of our transportation needs by making sure that our states, our regions, our cities start measuring the climate impact of their projects, both in general, because we need to do that, and as a requirement to get federal money. So these are things the American Jobs Plan does not do, and because of how Biden and the Democrats want to pass it, it can't do. The Invest Act is a lot broader, it's a lot more progressive, it's a lot more aggressive in terms of getting us towards a more sustainable transportation and climate future. So that's the bill that I'm watching more.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Okay, so I mean, this is our last question. And so Tejas, thanks so much for spending the morning with us and giving us some of your insight. The last question is, what should people do to help advance this very important issue, both at the policy level and their communities? And it sounds like one thing is call your representatives, call your senators, ask them to support the Invest Act. Also ask them to support probably a greater infusement into the infrastructure sector via budget reconciliation. That's another place where we can get some more climate funding for some of these infrastructure things that we've talked about. But what else do you see on the table, and what can people do after watching this to help improve the transit sector?
Pay attention to your local elections. The local government is where a lot of the action happens, and it's where a lot of the really on the ground things in terms of building your sidewalks, building more sustainable roads, and slightly obscure but very important zoning regulations. What are you allowed to build where? Those things happen at the city and county level. The city of Atlanta is having a very important mayoral and city council election coming up this November. There are likely other cities and counties across the state of Georgia that are having their local elections this November. And next year are the midterms that will have federal, state, and local elections happening. So pay attention from the top of the ballot all the way down to your local level, because all of those are going to play, they're going to play this game all together. And if you want a better future for the state of Georgia, for America, for the planet, you have to care about politics and policy at every level.
Yeah. Well, Tejas, thank you so much for spending some time with us. Everyone, thank you for watching this episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. Talk to your representatives, talk to your senators, talk to your local elected officials and stakeholders, and talk about how expanded transit and clean, renewable transit and equitable transportation is important to you, so that we can achieve these goals and have a better future. Tejas, thanks so much for joining us. And everyone, you can join us in 2 weeks for a new episode of the Eco Terra Chronicles, run by our Coastal Engagement Associate, Hermina Glass Hill. Thank you all so much, and thank you again,
Thank
Tejas.
you, Cody.